Supreme Court Justices Amy Coney Barrett and Elena Kagan have been testifying before a House Appropriations Subcommittee about the Supreme Court's $250 million budget request, including major increases they need for security. MS Now senior Capitol Hill reporter and Way Too Early host Ali Vitale is just outside the House hearing room for us. And here with me at the table, we have former federal prosecutor Barrett Berger and former House January 6th Committee Senior Investigative Counsel and former federal prosecutor Temidayo Agenga-Williams. It's good to have all of you guys with me this morning. Ali, I'm going to start with you since you're there. Tell us what you're hearing from the members and to what extent they've been straying off the topic at hand here.
That was always going to be the question, Antonia, for how interesting this hearing would be, because on its face, it's an Appropriations Committee hearing about looking for more money so that the justices can basically have more security. They're pointing to the landscape that shows a rise in threats, a rise in swatting instances, so much so that one of the justices, Amy Coney Barrett, actually spoke in pretty chilling personal detail about her own experiences with these security threats in recent years. And I just want to play for you that moment before we branch out to the broader themes. Watch.
Many of us, me included, have received threatening anonymous deliveries designed to intimidate and harass us. They have required me to, my children, to think about and see things that children should not have to see or think about. My security detail sent me home with a bulletproof vest, and I carried it into my house, put it into my bedroom, dropped it down on a table, turned around, and my 12-year-old son was standing in the doorway of my bedroom. I didn't expect that performing this service was going to put me in the position of explaining to my children what a bulletproof vest was and why I had to wear one.
That was one of the more chilling moments, Antonia, as she talked about the security landscape. And this is one that lawmakers themselves, and some of them mentioned this, are sensitive to, as Congress has seen a continual rise in the number of threats that members are experiencing. And so funding and the conversation around security is an active conversation for members of Congress as well. I think most of the questions when it came to security came around what would the increased security posture look like? Would it be mostly at residences? What would it look like at the court, but then also a balance on how to make a notoriously non-transparent institution of the Supreme Court slightly more transparent and making sure that security efforts don't undermine that. That's another key thread. And then to the extent that lawmakers branched off the topic of security, there were some mentions of the shadow docket, of the ways that the court takes up other cases, of jurisdiction questions. But I will say mostly today has been an exercise in messaging discipline and prudence in terms of talking points from the justices, which is not necessarily surprising to court watchers, nor to those of us who kind of got the preamble of this from a Congress perspective. I will say they're going to wrap up here in the next 10 or so minutes because they've got a second version of this hearing on the Senate side, but at least on the House side, mostly on message here for the justices.
Yeah, Ali, the one thing that I would say was a tiny bit surprising is just how nice everyone is actually generally being. Often when you watch these hearings on Capitol Hill, there are some tense, uncomfortable moments.
The bar is in hell.
The bar is in hell. And speaking about that, the conditions that we all and these justices are working in, Barrett, I want your thoughts on just sort of how or what you think has actually driven this sort of cultural and environmental shift here. At one point, I think it was Justice Kagan early on in the hearing, she was talking about how it used to be all about working with IT to make sure your BlackBerry was working, and they were thinking about physical security of the building, and things are so different now.
Things are so different now. And this is not just an issue plaguing the Supreme Court. This is something we've seen plaguing the entire federal judiciary. You have more threats against federal judges at this moment than we've ever seen in the past. And I think it comes from a few things. Number one, I think it comes from this really heated rhetoric that we hear right from the top, from the president's mouth, from members of Congress who are being very polite in this hearing, but are not always so polite when they talk about these judges. You hear every time somebody talks about a federal judge, it's an Obama appointee, it's a Bush appointee. This didn't used to be the thing. We didn't used to have to say the president who appointed the person in order to put in context their opinion. But also this real violent rhetoric after an opinion, the president sometimes calling judges, these scumbags or they're so dumb, really.
He's personally posted about Amy Coney Barrett.
Correct. very inflammatory things that then, incite people to these acts of violence or to these threats of violence. So it is a huge problem. We've even seen the Chief Justice come out and speak about this in a way that we don't usually see. So this is a really persistent and pernicious problem here.
It's been 7 years since the justices sat for a hearing like this and lawmakers had this opportunity. So in a way, it wasn't surprising to me, Timodayo, that some of them took the opportunity to ask other questions that had nothing to do with the broader sort of security apparatus here. What did you make of those parts, the conversations about the shadow docket? And it felt like both justices didn't really directly answer why we have seen so much more activity in that way with the court. There were also, though, comments about the American Bar Association and lawfare from one Republican congressman. What did you make of the direction some of these lawmakers took it?
So I think first it shows you how much we've been craving to hear from these justices outside of oral argument, that we really have not much insight into their thinking as they are a co-equal branch of government. I think what it also shows you is that people want accountability for these folks. When we talk about the shadow docket, the implication there is, are these justices making decisions without articulating to the public why they're making them? That's the import of the shadow decision issue. And in here, I think the justices have always been kind of political actors. But in the last 10, 15 years, the way they are seen as truly political players, I think, is out of this world. And I think that's what the congressmen were really getting at there. And we really couldn't ask them what they thought about the politics. It's outside the scope. But I think a lot of the attacks and the really violent rhetoric is because we no longer see these justices as removed or above the fray. We see them because they're in the fray because people like President Trump bring them in and make them and attacks them. But they're also in the fray as we see these decisions that we might not have insight into, or we see them choosing to wade into these deep political waters, whether it's overturning Roe v. Wade, longstanding precedent. So now when we see them as political actors, there's a way in which I think it's relevant whether we have insight into why they're doing what they're doing.
Do you think that there is a real argument to be made that the court's own actions in recent years, even just the use of the shadow docket over the course of the last year, may be part of the security concern, the environmental threat and sort of pattern that people are starting to see here?
So I don't think they are to blame for the threats they are receiving, but I think it's part of the broader conversation as to where does this branch of government fit in the conversation, right? They are not, they for so many years have sat on the Hill behind their cloaks, and I think now they are seen as political actors. So they're not to blame for the attacks that are going on, but they are part of the political discussion, and they can no longer act as if they are immune from being part of that.
One Congresswoman Barrett asked the justices about how, if it were possible, basically, for some of the funds they're requesting to be used to address root causes and transparency issues and possible investigations or accountability for people who are actually making these threats. And they've kind of pushed it off as that's a DOJ matter, not ours. And I understand that. But is that enough of a part of the conversation here? I mean, it does seem like unless you address the root causes of the violence and the frustration and anger and disinformation that is out there, increasingly arming, whether it's the justices or members of Congress, it might just sort of be a snowball that there really is no end to if you don't address what's starting all this in the first place.
Yeah, the lawmaker had a nice analogy. She said, if my kitchen's flooding, I turn the water off before I start mopping. And here, the security funding is the mopping. We need it. We need the mop to clean it up, but absolutely they need to turn that hose off. And this definitely lies in DOJ's laps. They need to really aggressively prosecute people who are making threats against the judiciary. At the same time, you need to control how we are speaking about judges and what we're putting out there. Even Todd Blanche, who's going to be in the hot seat tomorrow in his hearing, has made comments about the judiciary that, can potentially rile people up in this sense. So I think it is really incumbent on everybody from the top down to sort of rethink how we speak about judges. They are not immune from criticism by any means. Criticism is fair. It always has been. But when we, call them scum or we, really degrade them personally, and obviously with the attacks, I think it crosses over into a different sphere.
Yeah. Ali, I want your thoughts there on the Hill about whether or not some of the other sort of political developments of the week. I think most importantly, the passing of Senator Lindsey Graham, if that's actually going to complicate any of what comes next from the budgetary appropriations perspective, could it impact the process? Do you expect, now that we know his sister is his replacement for the time being, for this to move smoothly? What do you see?
Well, it adds some uncertainty on a lot of different fronts. And I think, yes, you're right to point out his role atop the Senate Budget Committee. That is likely to be filled by Senator Ron Johnson, a very different kind of lawmaker and a very different kind of senator. I think what became clear publicly is what's always been clear privately up here on Capitol Hill, which is that Lindsey Graham is sort of your consummate senator, wheeler and dealer. He's in all of these major bipartisan talks, even if himself on a public level was someone who was a partisan. He was always someone who was really a translator and a go-between for this White House and this Senate. And that's a role that is not easily replaced. And so when you try to apply it to a process that is as messy and complex as reconciliation, Johnson now is likely to assume that role on the Senate side. But there are still questions, even as soon as tomorrow, for Todd Blanche's hearing that Barrett was just talking about. Graham was a powerful and senior member of that Judiciary Committee, likely someone who was going to vote for Blanche. So it's not a question of where that vote was going to go, but it is a question now of if someone is going to be sitting in his place, and then what are the total numbers that we are then looking for on the Judiciary Committee, as there are a few members there that have expressed a skepticism towards Blanche. I'm thinking of John Cornyn, Tom Tillis, potentially even John Kennedy of Louisiana, who said he had some questions for Blanche that he wanted to ask tomorrow. Now, we've heard these senators offer tough talk in the past, but then ultimately they've mostly fallen in line with their party on the votes. We're going to see what actually happens with Blanche, but I think that the outgrowth of Graham, and frankly, this is a similar instance of McConnell, absences and unexpected vacancies in a very slim majority environment already just adds even further uncertainty to a process that for Republicans, they would like as little uncertainty as possible. And obviously that's not where we're at.